Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for the Humanities Festival for having me here. It's a really cool event and such a lovely space to be in. So thanks for coming out. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I came to do this work. I think what's really true is that I was a really talented mathematician. I was very clever at figuring things out. But I don't know how well I understood all of it, but I think as an art maker, I think my art has made me so much smarter than I could be without it. And I think that sort of barrier we have between smart and talented, between art and science and all those kinds of things is a lot about what my work is about. And I hope some of the sort of rifts that we can bring closer together. And so, like I said, I had this lapse in my comics making. I ran an arts magazine in Detroit, where I'm from, and in 2004, I was asked to make some comics around, or asked to be in an art show around the 2004 election. And this is one of the ones I made, and rather than the sort of narrative stuff that I had done before, I turned to using metaphor, using visual and verbal metaphor as a way to get at ideas without explaining it, without telling it. And also, it became a way to sort of strip out the words that I think keep us apart. I think you can agree with people a lot and have a lot of commonalities, but there's a few key words that all of a sudden you're on opposite sides. And so this one was about voting, or, a show of hands. So every single panel had to have something to do with hands. So this is sort of on my way back into making comics. Shortly after that, we organized an exhibition of games and art in Detroit. And I did the essay, the catalog essay, as this long-form comic on the philosophy of games, the history of games, how they worked, etc. And this is just one page from it, which is all fictional rabbits to talk about why games aren't just for kids. But this kind of work, when I decided to come back to doctoral school, when I came to Columbia, I said, this is the kind of thing I can do that can take really complex ideas and put them together in a way that seems, that is accessible, and might seem simple, but in fact it's really quite complex in the way that I can juxtapose images and text. And so I think some of the reasons I have gaps between my schooling is that I really love what goes on in the academy, but I really didn't like that it tends to stay there. And I felt like, as I came back, what I could do with comics was deal with the kinds of ideas I wanted to deal with, but also reach people outside of it. And they seemed to buy that argument, and they let me into school. And so this is one of the first comics I made as a doc student. I was fortunate to have then 90-year-old professor of philosophy Maxine Green, who's if anybody does know her, anybody know her in the audience? She's awesome. You do? And he concurs. She was then 90 years old, and I had a class in her living room, and this is someone who was a dynamo in her mind, could connect all these ideas. But when she was rolled into class, she was wheelchair-bound then, you weren't quite sure that she was going to make it through. And, but when it was time to talk, she came so alive, and I was like, I can draw Maxine as Maxine looks, but it was more important to get her as Maxine feels. And so, this thing took her as the top, which is static until you pull it, and then when you pull it, it's full of life. So I sort of continued that metaphors and stripping out saying exactly what it is I'm talking about. So this piece, my advisor in English education asked me to do a chapter in her book on narrative research. She says, do what you want. You have the last chapter. Talk about research. And so I made this comic that is either about the act of doing research or the act of drawing or about how we see. And the response to it completely depended on who you were. Some people thought it was about one, some people thought it was about the other, and it totally depended on the audience. And I think that was my goal going in, but I think that really occurred to me the idea that you could make this thing sort of, had multiple access points. And I stripped out all the language of field specificity so that people could read it and they could get what it's about and they didn't have to know anything. And then people who knew lots about the field could also get that. So it's sort of a tricky dance to do, but it's one that's been really generative for me. So when I came to starting my dissertation, I wanted to continue that. So this is very much, and sort of spoilers here, that this is very much about education. But it's a book that never names the word. It doesn't say education, it doesn't say schools, it doesn't say teachers. It's about interdisciplinarity, it doesn't say the word disciplines, it doesn't say any of those things. But it deals with all of them in metaphor. And so I'll get to how I came up with the word unflattening later, but I'll deal with the sort of opposite, flatness. And so what is the problem I'm pushing against? And by flatness, I didn't mean a sort of literal kind of thing. I meant a narrowness of our sight, a sort of limitation of our possibilities, and really forgetting the what might be and accepting the how it is. You know, this world where we have lots and lots of possibilities, but they're almost all determined from our very start. And because I had this word unflattening, and had this background in mathematics, I turned to Edwin Abbott's 1880s novella Flatland, and I'm guessing a few of you are familiar with that. A handful. All right. If you're not, it doesn't really matter. Flatland is the story of the geometric inhabitants of this two-dimensional world. And so there are circles and squares and triangles and lines, and they can move east and west and south and northwards. But they have no concept of upwards. They can't conceive of anything off their plane of existence. And so you and I can all look down on a flatlander and say, that's ridiculous. Of course, there's upwards. But what's upwards for us? What are the directions that we can't think about because we can't see them? And so that became a big driving question for me. What are the sort of directions that we can't imagine because of the limitations of our sight, the limitations of the way we do our thinking? And so again, as I said, I was dealing in education, and I have parents that are teachers and a lot of experience paying attention to teachers. And I feel like the institution of education has become very much a series of steps. It's a recipe that people go through. It's things that are done to us rather than things that are sort of opened up with us. And I thought about that in terms of the way that our learning can be put into boxes, whether it's the box of time or the box of space, or the box of subject. And so we start to take those boxes inside ourselves. So if you have somebody who studied art and also studied mathematics, you think that's pretty strange. If that person also tells you that he spent most of his life playing tennis, a little bit on the tour, and then made his living teaching it for most of that time, you think that's really strange, because we're not supposed to be in all those different boxes. They're supposed to be separate. But I think really the boxes are the thing that's artificial. We've constructed these things, and we started to believe that they're real. And it's something I think we need to push back against. And so that idea that our thinking is getting put into rows, put into lines, very much comes into the way that scholarship is supposed to look. 12-point font, double-spaced, 1.5 by 1 by 1 by 1 inch margins. That's not to say that it's bad. This is not an anti-text talk or book. It's to say, why is that the option that we have? And I think the roots of this go far back. They go as far back as certainly Plato, who said, you know, he looked at something bent in water and said, well, it's not really bent, so your senses, you can't really trust your senses in that. And Descartes comes along much later, and it says the same thing. We can't trust our senses at all. We're thinking machines, and thinking machines handle rows and rows of text really well. They don't handle things you do with your body so well. And so that's one of the other driving questions is, what are we failing to see when we only count one mode? And what might we start to make visible when we bring in the other ways we make meaning, the other ways of knowing that we all have, and incorporate that in the way we do our learning, the way we do our teaching, and the way we do our scholarship? And so I wanted to sort of make a slight aside in the work to sort of say I talk very much about ways of seeing, but I mean it as a metaphor for ways of knowing. I mean, my work is very much about visuals because I'm dealing with visuals. But I mean it more broadly. And so as a semi-apology, I have this page about my dog. But you should always put your dog into this kind of work. And so the thing about a dog is that you know the dog's sense of smell is stronger than yours and mine. We all know that, right? But what's really important about it is it's more nuanced, which means I can come up here and I see the color of the stage, it's gray stage, I can see the kind of lines in it, but a dog comes here and it knows who was on this stage earlier today, it knows who was on this stage yesterday, it knows maybe about as far as a week back who was on the stage. It has access to layers of time that I simply don't have. And I think that's a kind of upwards, a kind of way of experiencing the world that, I'm not saying we need to all have smell-o-vision books in the future, but what I am saying is how do we bring in other ways that people make meaning and have them count and be part of how we do our learning. And so unflattening is this ridiculously simple idea. You guys all know this. I always feel funny when I point it out, but then I watch people in the audience do it. So, this is not the same view as this. They're not. And neither of them is correct. But having that sort of displacement between our eyes, it allows us to see the world in a slightly different way. And you get the same thing when you move your head, you get the same thing when you move around things. But that gives us perspective, it gives us depth, it gives us a different way of seeing the world that is really valuable. And you don't have to stop at two. We can bring in many ways of seeing. And so for me, comics were this thing that I not only, I loved to do as a kid, but they were also this way of being amphibious. I could breathe in the worlds of image and text at the same time, and maybe find ways to step out of the sort of narrowness of my own thinking, and maybe get a look at it and from a different place, and maybe find some other ways to make discoveries. And so I want to turn and talk a little bit more formally about comics themselves, and I think we're in a time where here's a festival devoted to graphic things, including comics. That's not something you would have seen so much of 10 years ago, 20 years ago at all. We're in a time when people are excited about this as kind of a new form. But the truth is, this is not so new. You can look back as far as the 1890s, and this is often called, Richard Alcott's Yellow Kid is often called the father of American comics. Whether that's true or not, you can look as far back as the 1830s and Rudolf Topfer, the Swiss artist, things that look a lot like comic books. But you can look even farther back, the Bayeux Tapestry, the Mayan Codex. It's an illuminated manuscript, which I don't have a date for. And you can go farther back still, people doing things that look a lot like comics. And you can go all the way back to the dawn of when we are us. And it's not to say that this is a comic book, because I'm not claiming that. But I am claiming that people have been trying to make sense of their world through images since we were us. And that's a big part of what made us us. So we can say everybody has to be literate in a reading way, but yet in a room like this, if I say how many, and maybe this is a self-selected room, so maybe just a random group of 100 people, you can ask and you'll get a handful of people who say, yes, I can draw. But everybody's got to say, I can read and write. So I think we've sacrificed something and we've let it be the domain of artists and the talented at the expense of all the other people who can make sense of their world through it that should be, and that all of them do naturally when they're 3 years old and 4 years old and 5 years old and 6 years old, and then it starts to taper off sometime around that. So let's say a few specific words about the comics form itself. I mean, you think about it very much as words and pictures for sure. The most popular definition is Scott McCloud's 1993 Understanding Comics, which is a comic about comics, and certainly very responsible for, big influence on me, but very responsible for comics showing up in libraries and comics showing up in education. And so Scott's definition is juxtapose pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence. So basically, here's my fist, I draw a nice box around it. Here's my fist, I draw another box around it. Nothing happens. Comics are static and flat, but you guys all made the meaning. You all made the punch happen between here and here. And this definition is very expansive. It allows us to bring in all those kinds of things I showed you earlier to say, wow, well, maybe we've been making comics all along. And so again, the reader is animating this static medium. And this flat thing, where no time happens, time has to be written in space. And we've been at this for a long time too. This is my redrawing of a Paleolithic lunar calendar from 30,000 years ago, which is not that unlike Scott McCloud's definition of comics. We see the changes in this sort of sequential thing. And so sure, comics do what he says. They're sequential. You read this left to right, top to bottom, but because it's visual, you can't help but take in the whole all at once, which means you start making connections from the lower right back up to the upper left. You start making them in multiple directions, and in fact, just within any single panel, do you read the words first, or do you read the image first, or back and forth? Or do you read, and I quiz people often on this, and some people take in the whole page. We probably all do it without realizing it. And then you start to focus, and then you go back and forth. So there's something a little less than sequential happening, or a little more than sequential. And I think that to me, that's where comics get really exciting, is this simultaneity, where we experience the whole all at once, and we also have these sort of separate moments. And so if we think about it in the ways that our heads work, you guys are all here, you've had experiences this morning, and you've got experiences to come. So you're marching through time fairly sequentially, I assume, unless anyone's not here. But your thoughts, are not doing that. So something I've said maybe has triggered some, oh yeah, or you're anticipating something, or you're thinking about what you're going to do later. So even while you're marching through time in a sequential, linear fashion, your thoughts are adrift and moving in multiple directions, and all at once. And I think that's something that comics do really well, is they hold both of these modes together. And so the very flatness, the very thing that in this age where we have phones that can show us videos and projects things, the actual flatness of comics is kind of what makes them the most exciting. And in fact, my original use of the word unflattening came with how I was saying, wow, I can do so much in this single piece of paper that it doesn't seem possible, that it's made it unflat. It then became to have all these other meanings over time. But flat surfaces allow us to do all this stuff. So we often compare comics to storyboards, because like you care about here, and you care about here, and you care about here. But in comics, you not only care about here, you care about the shape of this thing, you care about the size of it, you care about its orientation, you care about what it's next to and where it is in the whole thing. So you care about the individual drawings and also the meta drawings. And that ties into this nice definition by the Canadian cartoonist Seth, where comics are poetry and graphic design, which is quite different than thinking about them as prose plus illustration. It's changing it in a significant way, I think. And so you can see that, maybe I'll let you look at this comic for a second when you laugh. Yeah, the only way this little guy can get the fruit is because he lives in comic book land, where the rules of time and space don't quite mean the same things that you're used to. And a couple other examples. This is a French cartoonist, Marc Antoine Watteau. If I gave this to you as 9 separate panels, what would you miss? I may just tell you. Yeah, you'd miss the triangle, which, this is a comic about the Louvre. So if you've been to the Louvre, you know it's representing the pyramid out there. And so, but it really has to be, you have to take in the whole. You know, if you get this on a Kindle and you're like swiping one at a time, it's destroyed. In the same way that a poem, if all of a sudden you just decide, well, forget about meter and all that, we're just going to string it out, it doesn't work anymore. Similarly, this Gasoline Alley from the 1930s, our character bumbles sequentially across the scene, but it's one simultaneous image. And it's actually even weirder than that. And I think I had to show this a lot of times before I realized how weird it is, because he keeps starting at the left side, which doesn't make any sense at all, but we accept it. We accept that sort of weirdness of the space. And that whole idea that you care both about the individual drawings, the drawing, and the meta drawing can bring, the whole space can sort of be alive and part of the way you make stories. So in this, Winsor McCay, this is probably the 1910s or something, you know, his frames become a literal part of the action, and he's sucked up by it. This is more recent from Young Avengers, where the panels are both separate parts of the story in that sequential way, but they're also this other dimension. So they're representing another way of thinking about space. And Nina Paley's cartoon here, the panels become a psychological space. And to me, this is where they get really exciting. Yes, I mean, I like drawing little individual images, but how I can think about the whole space, that whole design sense or poetry sense of it. So this is from my chapter on ruts, and I'm contrasting my wife's commute with the sort of typical commuter. And I could have, in a sort of illustrational sense, said, well, here's one kind of commute, and on the other hand, here's what my wife does. And that, you would have gotten the idea, it would have worked. But I'm really interested in how the very shape of the space can convey the idea. How can I embody it rather than illustrate it? So in the background, the grid structure has the repeated commute, the out and back of somebody in Manhattan. And you can see it repeated on the 16 grid. But in the front, we mapped my wife's commute, which was changing every single day. She went to different locations. We mapped a bunch of them onto things of Manhattan, onto maps of Manhattan. And I had noticed, you know, like how much that Manhattan could look like a falling leaf or a feather as it drifts. And so her route sort of was this kind of drift through the city. And so now, I mean, it's still a fairly simple page in like what I've drawn, but there's all these levels of information like stacked on top of each other in a very not flat sort of way. And I think, to me, that's where the sort of power in comics can be, is that you can get a lot of ideas in the way you're juxtaposing these things, in the way you're making layers out of something that's still flat. I've continued this. This is not from Unflattening. This is from the Boston Globe. This is a comic on entropy. And it's a comic about entropy. You know, entropy is things that fall apart, right? Your clothes don't pick themselves up, your coffee gets cold, omelets don't turn back into eggs, right? So that's a very linear thing. And so my top part is linear. It goes do-do-do-do-do, do-do-do-do-do. And as we get here, it starts to show how entropy works. And then it says yet, and the yet jumps you over to here. I'm a little vertically challenged to show you all of this, but it drops you down here, and you're dropping down, which works. But then all of a sudden it says, you're going to read this way, and then you're going to read bottom to top. So you're going to read right to left and bottom to top. So it's not just about adding images to ideas, it's about how we read itself and how we structure reading. And that way of reading, because the whole point of the comic was this is about life, these sort of moments of order that go against where everything else is running downhill. And so the comic mirrors that in the very way that you have to read it. And so for me, even though I make complicated drawings, the larger part of my work is in figuring out how do I have somebody experience the reading of this. And this is like 30 notebook pages in and about 3 months of work before the little star, like, oh, I finally get it. And so I think this is your local cartoonist, Chris Ware, I'm hoping you're all familiar with. Ware's work, I think, very much does this idea of sequential and simultaneity, as all these the sort of tangents that our brains work in, the sort of trouble you have writing things down on a lined piece of paper that make a lot of sense when you're out running. Because they're there. They're like, oh yeah, but this goes to this and this goes to that, but how does that work? So I think in thinking about what thinking looks like, I think comics are this incredibly powerful tool to represent the shape of our thinking, to represent the complexity of it. So that's half of my argument. The other half, and that's sort of what we'll taper with, is that they're also, I think, a really powerful way to generate our thinking. And so I worked alone. This is a solo project, but I think I had the best collaborator I could have because I had my visual system, which all the time is figuring out things in the world. It's making relationships. I know that he's in front of you, and I can sort of figure out all those edges, and it allows me to map out the space because it's making all these decisions all the time. So when you make a mark on a piece of paper, that system that is already doing all this work starts to see things in it that you didn't anticipate. And so people ask me all the time, which do you do first, words or pictures? And I say, yes. And it's true, because I make these sort of diagrams of things, and I think, and I have ideas, I have this thing I want to search for, but I don't know where I'm going. And I really have to put things down and pay attention to them, and then draw them again and pay attention to them, and draw them again and pay attention to them. And eventually, if I trust it, and sometimes it's painfully long, but it'll take me to places that I don't expect all the time. And I think I show this is reproduced in the back of the book. This is the very first sort of roadmap sketch I made about 3 years before the book was done. And it's cool to me because it's got Easter eggs, like stuff that happened, stuff that didn't happen. But I think the more important two things about it are this, that one, for people who don't draw, finished drawing looks like magic, right? It's like Athena coming out of Zeus's head all fully formed, like, yep, there it is. But those of us who do draw or make things of other sorts, you know the sort of mess that it is. You know the iterations that it is. And I think this sort of, I don't know, democratizes, but it's something, getting that insight into where it came from, I think, is really important. Because it's a struggle. It's a struggle, and you have to learn from the things you make. And the other reason I think this is important to share is that this is not a picture of my thinking. This is it. Without this and the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other sketches, I can't make the work I make. I would make something else, but I didn't write a text and then say what pictures go with it. The pictures said this is the kind of thing that you're going to make, and you have to pay attention. And so I'm going to move to the close here with one specific example of how the drawings themselves forced me to do research that I wouldn't have done, which is the case throughout, but this is a pretty clear one. So I have, in the chapter on imagination, I have a page about, I thought very early to do a page about the transformative power of stories. And very early on, it occurred to me that Scheherazade and the Knight's Tales would be just the right thing to play with, and her stories within stories would be really interesting to draw, and it would make my point. So I was excited for that, and I started with the idea, if you're familiar with the film Powers of 10 or the book Zoom, where they're like zooming in on a postcard and I keep zooming, that I would do something like that, where I would be zooming in on something and each panel would sort of refer to the one before in some way, real or metaphorical, and it would sort of move across the page in the way that Scheherazad's name felt to me. So I had all these rules, and all these rules I was going to follow, and that was going to teach me where to go. But as I got to the middle of the page, what I wanted to say is by stories, I don't just mean the fanciful or the sort of fantastic, but I also mean stories, things like science. It's a kind of story, right? And so if I was writing, I would have said, and I also mean things like science, and put a period, and I would have been done. But I'm not writing, and I'm not illustrating, I don't think. I want to find something that actually does that, and then fits into all this scheme that I've created here. And so I started thinking a lot about where could I go with this, and so I decided I'm going to look at when the Knight's Tales were written down, where they were written down, and eventually stumbled across the work of a man named Al-Tusi, who's a Persian astronomer working in the Arab Golden Age, whose work was later picked up by Copernicus 300 years later, uncredited for Copernicus's revolutionary work. And I was like, that's awesome, because I already have this page about Copernicus, and things are going together. And this page, the key to this, nothing changed except the point of view, which changed everything. I was like, these pieces are coming together. And so I spent a few weeks sort of trying to, reading through the math and astronomy notes to try to make sense of it well enough that I could talk about it, and also dealing with the visual part. How do I make this work? How is it all going to fit together? And it comes out to be these 3 inches, basically, of the book, which I can blow up bigger. And the key here is that there's nothing in my notes, there's nothing in my proposal for my dissertation that says you should reference a piece of relatively obscure Arab astronomy for your work. There's nothing about that. But there's everything about my drawings that said you have to go directions that you don't expect to go. And I think that sort of element of surprise, it's not research as filling in bricks, it's not learning as doing that, it's learning as opening spaces. And so I want to end with an example that's not mine, because I've been fortunate enough to get to share the work a lot, and I think the main question I tend to get is, or maybe not the main one, but people say, well, I buy it, but I don't draw. I don't draw. So that might work for you, but it doesn't work for me. And so the last lot of years now, I've been teaching classes primarily to people who don't draw and getting to do workshops and people who identify as non-drawers. And I love it because I don't believe it that any of them are not drawers. Anyway. So I want to share a student's work. So this girl, this was when I was still a postdoc at the University of Calgary, at a sort of smallish class called Comics as a Way of Thinking, with mostly English students, writing students. And so she came in, very shy student, definitely would describe herself as a non-drawer, but was really interested in the form and well, you'll see. So this is a little excerpt from her final. And so it's got this very negative things. It's sort of atlas-like on the left side, and says sometimes she could feel the weight of the words on her shoulders. And then on the right, it says, but she is strong, and there's all these positive things emanating from the sun there. And she really was interested in all the, I showed you a few panels of these panel breaking kinds of things. She was really into that, how could she play with the panel as a frame to look through, but also as a physical element of the story. So this is a story about a girl who couldn't fit in a box, and they laughed from their boxes that fit as she contorted and twisted, unable to find a place. And the final page here. So she makes her own box out of words, sounds, and pictures, and soon she learns that there is no need for borders, that boxes restrict her unnecessarily, since she can go anywhere she wishes. Yeah, I mean, I've read this a lot, and each time it's this very powerful moment, I think. And we can say, I mean, you're looking at her drawing skills. Is this somebody that might have their work up across the street? Maybe not, maybe not. But I think when you think about this as a piece of thinking, it doesn't get more powerful than this. Her understanding of how to use the form is tremendous. her understanding of how to get at her own thinking through it is tremendous. I gave a workshop in the fall, and I did some of the exercises I do, and this very serious journalist, done this for a long time, she's like, she made this crazy thing out of cutouts, and she'd done a whole bunch. She's like, normally I don't really like these artsy craftsy things. And I said, that's not really about that. It's not a piece of art. That's a piece of your thinking. And I think that distinction is really important. I think coming back to smart versus talented, I think we've gotten in a place where, for a while now, there's the talented people who make art, and the rest of the people are sort of said, no, we don't do this. And I think my experience in all my classes is that, in fact, everyone can do this, and everyone can learn more about themselves and about the way they think in the process. So, I think when we think about education, if we try to understand the ways people actually make meaning in the world and find ways to bring them in and make them count, I think it changes where we go. So thank you.
At this time, if you raised your hand, we can bring a microphone to you for Q&A. We have 2 going around. We have one in the center aisle right here.
I have to find a place to stand that's not right there. Or I have to grow.
Well, you answered my question somewhat that I was formulating.
Sure.
But, okay, sort of like the relationship between your sort of standard artistic standards like, composition and design and black and white contrast and all that. So there were a lot of times where it seemed like your use of those, let's say, protocols definitely melded with your thoughts and ideas and meaning. Mm-hmm. And other times it was more, not decoration, but just something to make the panel more beautiful and more interesting, like that very last one that had a lot of dark background. So I don't know if you could comment any more about that, or there's sometimes that you do something just...
You mean this?
Yeah.
Oh, so this is in the book, but it doesn't look like this in the book. This is I couldn't get a triptych in the book. So if I'd had my way, this would have been in the book. I'm glad you can I talk about this first, and then maybe that'll tie to your question. So this is also a different version of this I remade for the cover. My editor was into this, and we didn't know what I was doing for the cover. So this page is near the end, and the example, I don't know, I'm sure many of you can relate to this. I have a really hard time finding shoes that fit. It's not like I have an uncommon size. It's a very common size. But they're not the shape of my foot. And there's a page in the book where I have other people with men's 10.5s, and we've all traced our foot. And none of them look the same, just in that two-dimensional slice. They don't. They stick out in different ways. So I did on Twitter and Facebook, and anyone who would, I crowdsourced people's feet from around the world. So people traced their feet and sent them to me. And the 10.5s, the 10.5 male ones, I did a specific thing with. But so these are all, there's text on the actual page. So the page, this side of it, those are sort of a made-up foot that I repeated. And once it hits the bottleneck there, which looks a little more like an hourglass on the book cover, when I hit the bottleneck there, they open up, and these are all real feet. They're my tracings of their tracings. But it was all to talk about, it's a pretty simple idea, right? If you can't get shoes that fit, it's very hard to walk. And if you're sort of standardizing, if you're thinking about standardizing our footwear, you think about standardizing our education, if it's hard to walk, it's hard to walk. Yeah, I think until you look at this image closely, I think it's hard to know what it is. I don't think anybody knows. What's that? It is nice. I had no idea what I was going to do. I just send me your feet, and I got all these feet, and then I had to do something with them. I really had no idea what I was going to. I had the thought to compare them to mine. That was very simple. But once I'd gathered all these feet, I felt obligated to use them. I'm sort of. So I think your question is a good one, though. Your more general question is when is it mostly the idea, and when is it the art? And my goal in it, and obviously, it's more successful in other times, is that they both lead. is that if it's, it's like two rains, if the picture is stunning and it doesn't have much to say, I can't use it. And that's happened. There are a few things that I scrapped that I was like, that's really cool, but it doesn't do anything. And if it's like, I got the ideas, it's like, but like, why am I wasting time with pictures? Why don't I just write about it? So, I mean, you can judge the success of all those things on your own, but I think for me, when those two forces come together, that's when it's best. And I think the Scheherazade one for me was this sort of really defining moment where I was like, oh, that took me places I didn't mean to go. And I mean, that's always the case, but that one's just sort of easy to see because it's so, so anyway, thank you. Oh.
Question over here.
We have a ringer here.
Hey, I've got a question for you about your kind of creation process. You're interested in making us think outside the box, and your chosen form of communication is a medium that is kind of defined by boxes.
And I like to draw lots of little boxes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you talk about, is there irony, or is there kind of hoops you jump through to move from outside the box to talking about that using the boxes?
I'm certainly aware of it, and there was one comics scholar who reviewed it as if the entire book was about comics, like all my references to boxes had something to do with the form. I'll tell you later. But I certainly was aware of the irony. I want to say something about boxes and constraints. I mean, I think we tend to think about that sort of out of the box as like liberating. I'm not quite so convinced about that. So I'm not sure I would say this is about out of the box. What I would say is that I like to draw lots of boxes around myself and find ways to still make sense of them. So the idea, I was colleagues when I was at the University of Calgary with Christian Book, who's famous for this book called Eunoia, that each chapter has a single vowel. So it's got the A chapter. I mean, they only uses one vowel to do this sort of massive work of poetry. And it's a stunning achievement of constraints. But what Christian said is, that's not the difficult part. It's not difficult to find words that only have A's in them. What's difficult is like to also obey meter and all the other aesthetic rules that you have to pay attention to. So the real trick to it is to have enough constraints. So for me, it's like I have to build enough. Like the Scheherazade page, there's what is it going to be? Every image is going to link to the other one through this kind of real or metaphorical zoom. Then there's the shape of the page. Then there's the level of ideas it has to have. And so I try to draw a lot of boxes. And then there's the sort of primary boxes, like I'm not going to name any of the disciplines I'm working with. I'm not going to put any language in it that keeps people out. So to me, I think my goal is to make as many boxes as possible, and then trust that those rules will help me figure out where I'm going, and they'll push me to do things I don't expect. Yeah, but it's definitely ironic that but I don't think I will ever say that I'm that into out of the box. I think I'm sort of torn on that statement in general. So, thanks, Dean.
Next question's right here.
It's a very popular
Thank
role.
you. First, I had to tell you that I'm a 10.5 5E. And I can't find shoes that fit me because not only that size, but I have flayed feet, as a podiatrist explained to me. So the shape is outward. And there's no shoe manufacturer in their right mind that would make that for the mass market.
Right
except
here?
for
Right on
Crocs.
Which?
Crocs. Someone had that shape. And who wants to wear those?
Yeah.
Okay. So
Well,
that's just,
can we compare shoes after?
yes.
Thank you. This is the best.
Love to talk about shoes. So I want that painting over my mantelpiece. Anyway, the drawing. The question I had was I had a very hard time not getting out of the box of looking from left to right across a column
Sure.
every time.
Yeah.
You were trying to get out of that box as well, too. And I was just wondering if in countries and cultures where they go from right to left in their writing or up and down, if they look at your drawings and others in a different kind of way.
That's a really interesting, I mean, obviously the influx of manga here, and some of which are printed mirrored and some of which are printed the way that they would be there, but which I think that's more common now, but I find it very strange because you're reading text this way, but you're supposed to move that way, but people get used to it very quickly, and I can't say because it's been translated, but not into one that's flipping it. So I don't know that specific thing. I mean, I suspect the answer is probably yes, that there are people that would have some difficulties with it. I know in manga, I don't know that I can explain this clearly, but where we might make it just a very straight 9-panel grid where there's sort of T's in between everything, so they're all lining up. That they won't do that because there's a tendency to want to read down, which I think we have less prevalent with. So everything will have a brick structure so that so there's no crosses. I guess crosses would be better than T's there. Does that make sense? And I never noticed. I just read something on it recently, and I then started looking at manga, and like there's 0 places where there's a chance for you to do that. So I'm very cognizant of how people, I mean, I do personally, I happen to make strange composition. So I'm very, hopefully very thoughtful about how people encounter the page. And maybe, because I have other examples, I have this one which I can, this one, and we could talk about the process, but it has this opening paragraph that asks you to sort of read down. And I was very excited about the idea, and I had a ton of it figured out, but I had a real problem because once you've read down, there's no reason to come back up. And my solution, which is in the sketches afterwards, was eventually to sort of stumble on I started drawing an arrow, and I was like, no, you can't draw arrows, because that's lazy cartooning. But I noticed that my arrow sketch looked a lot like my thumb. And I was like, oh, well, of course, and I had this anyway, that's the short version of it. But so the hand is this thing that brings you up, but you can see here, you can see the choices, like see the little curved box at the bottom of that row there, that leads into the hand. So there's some very particular choices to not force the reader, but to guide the reader to say, and also the stuff like the thought balloon that's also the clouds at the upper top. It's like moved up enough so that you kind of are guided to stay there, and then you're guided to follow the thumb back up. So I tried to, my wife is an abstract gestural painter in one of her incarnations. Wrong word. But she's not a comics reader. And I made one comic that snaked once, and then she started reading all my comics like they did that, so having her as my first reader is really helpful because like I know if I've made all the clues right, that I can, then I'm pretty safe with everybody else. Yeah. It's up to them, really.
Do you ever do anything like that last picture of the feet without words? And do you ever find that the words actually might interfere and might constitute their own box that's limiting in some kind of way?
There are wordless pages in the book, and wordless comics is something I teach, and I haven't done. I mean, I've done sequences that are pages, and it's sort of a regret for this book that I didn't have one chapter that was wordless. It's something I think will happen in the follow-up work, and it's also, I've been trying to see if I can do an academic research article that's wordless. I haven't quite figured it out. I did a comic on climate change for Nature for the Paris talks, and it's it was teamed with with a science journalist. And after it, I started working on how could I do this sort of greenhouse gas thing without any words. And I didn't finish it, I was just doing it for myself, but I think it's a really great question. I think there's a lot to be said for that, and I frequently now when I teach comics, start with wordless comics before we get to the ones that have words. Because I think people who haven't read many comics tend to just go words first. Or I don't know, I'm not.
I can understand how your thinking is the drawing, and every drawing is new, but was there a time when you did a drawing and some astonishing insight emerged that surprised you?
Astonishing insight, that's a high bar. Boy, that's a tough one. I mean, I think I'm always surprised. I mean, I don't know, that's a great question. And I think you almost mean like a scientific insight that comes from the drawing. Is that? I don't know. I mean, I feel like that's maybe true, that I've learned things about, I mean, especially in the sketch process, less in the sort of finished page process, that I've like ideas that I wasn't planning to do, which I'm sure, I mean, that's true of writers, it's true of, certainly true of scientists. You know, I show some of the stuff like, it doesn't matter. I think that's definitely possible. I can't point to one. I love that question though, so sorry I don't have a better
For
answer.
question over here.
What was it like defending your thesis? Did you feel like you had to explain it to your audience, or they, you know, were well aware of what was going on, or did you have to jump through lots of hoops to even get to the point of them being well aware of what was going on?
Yeah, it was pretty anticlimactic. It's a disappointing story, and I'm going to just click to one for a second. Almost there. So the thing is, I came in saying I wanted to make comics, right? That was, so they accepted me with that understanding. I came in really naively. I mean, I'd been out of school for a while, and I didn't know it was a big deal. I thought, you know, people have read Mouse, they've read Persepolis, they've read Understanding Comics. This argument's over. Like, but I learned when I was in the academy that it wasn't quite over. But it wasn't my committee, really, they didn't have much qualms about it. I think my cohort had more of them because they were like scared or something, like, can you really do this? Shouldn't you explain it? But as I realized that it was sort of a political statement, my work really shifted. I mean, this book is much more about itself than I intended it to be. I thought I was just going to make a comic about something in education, but instead it's very self-referential. So my committee, I mean, partly I made comics from day one and taught them, you know, and I wrote about comics also in text. So we'd had that conversation for 5 years before I got to the defense, and they saw all the pieces along the way. So it was, the defense was just, and yeah, so it was kind of, and the work got a lot of attention very early. Before I'd actually drawn a page, the Chronicle of Higher Ed, there's this guy at Columbia that's drawn, and I was like, oh crap, I haven't drawn anything yet. But, so it had a lot of momentum that they weren't going to be able to slow down. But I did want to share this page because it's, so this, I think this was 47 in the dissertation version. It's like 54 or something in the book. But, so the one thing that you do have to do is the Office of Doctoral Studies, the people that measure your margins and your footnote, all that stuff. And so the truth of this is I wasn't quite done with it when I defended. I had not drawn the last chapter, and you can't like stay up all night and just like type a bunch of stuff yet. Like, you know, so I had drawings in there, but my drawings take like 100 hours, and these were done in, all of them were done in maybe 20 hours. So I was kind of hoping when I gave it to the Office of Doctoral Studies it would take at least a week for them to get back to me. It took them an hour. And he had feedback on exactly one page. This one. The only one he knew how to look at. And he said, on page 47, you have a figure. Figure 1. You need to have a list of figures at the start of your book that says, figure 1, page 47. And I'm looking at it, and I'm like, he's kidding. And he's not kidding. He's not kidding at all. And what's interesting, so this page comes before it. And I don't talk, I mean, the book just starts as a comic book, and then it gets to this point, it says it's not always done this way. And then you turn the page, and it's this really jarring thing, because it's sort of, this is where I turn to, like quite literally turn to the reader and say, this is what it's supposed to look like, and I go through this sort of, there's Plato and Descartes in there, and I go through that and say, you know, why is this the case? And this guy made the point, like, I would never have thought to put a list of figures in. That's brilliant. But so the dissertation version has the table of figures with one listed in a page of. My committee was much more understanding of it. The Office of Doc Studies, not so much. But thank you.
We have a question over here.
Did you say that you think that everyone should be able to draw?
I think everyone can.
Can't?
Can. That's a
So
terrible
where does
slip.
this optimism come from? Like, why?
Experience.
But why do you, what do you think the world would be like if everybody drew as often as they wrote? Because I saw you making that analogy.
As often, I don't know,
Or,
how often
mean,
does
like,
everybody
with the
write?
with the comfort.
I mean, how many people spend a lot of time writing all the time besides like text messages and stuff? Not that much, right? So here's what I think. Number one, we're space, like we navigate the world through space, right? You all know how to do that. You all have a sense of this room that you're in, whether you a professional drawer or not. And I mean, you know, obviously visual things are slightly subject to, you know, there's things that people can't see, so that's not totally true. But all of us have a sense of space of the world. And so if you think about drawing like, hey, everybody needs to draw like Chris Ware, well, no, that's not going to happen, because it's a very particular set of skills, that's a very particular set of things that made Chris Ware and all his experiences. But if you think about drawing as how do we organize relationships in space, everybody draws. Everybody knows how to do it. Everybody who's got a little kid and the kid asks them to draw something, everybody will draw it, right? So I think it's when, and it only occurred to me this week that I could have done a workshop with you guys, and I would have, to do a drawing exercise. If you want to look up the thing that I've done it as a Twitter challenge. If you go to gridsgestures.com, grids gestures, or look up those two words, you'll probably find it. I do something in about 7 minutes where I get people to think about, I'm not going to go into it, doesn't matter. But I'm saying people understand how to orient things in space, and they understand that if they're thinking about, if they had a frustrated day, they make lines like this, and if they had a good day, they make lines like this. And do you need to be an artist to know that one of them hurts, and the other one you can lie down on and it's nice? Everybody knows that. And so the things I do in my class is I start from that point. I start from finding ways to draw that aren't the ways you think that you can draw, right? And once you do that, then, you know, then it changes you. I think it doesn't, I had a student in class here, she said, yeah, I doodled all the time, but I never thought anything of it. And it's like, now I realize that there's actually a lot going on with that. And I think that's really important. I think it's not, and you might not have seen the beginning about the talented smart thing, but it's not about saying everybody needs to make works of art that belong on museum walls. I don't believe that at all. But I do believe really strongly that everybody can make things that help them understand their own thinking better. And I mean, we do it. Like you tell everybody, you know, if you're, like, study this, if you have your hands like under your lap or tied behind you and you can't think as well. There's pretty well documented studies on that. So the fact is you're thinking through the ways you move your body. There's very good evidence that gesture came before speech. And it's certainly true for babies, you know, babies they can tell you what they want before they can talk, before they can write, certainly. So I really do believe it, yes. I mean, it's a longer conversation, but I think you have to change what you mean by drawing. I mean, not change it, but you have to say you're not going to draw like a certain person. You're going to like make sense of it. And I see it in every student that they can make sense of things. And often the ones who come in the least like with experience often do the most interesting things. Because I think I'm probably, you know, I have like a very specific skill set. I grew up reading 70s and 80s superhero comics. It's hard for me to not draw like that. I try not to. I try to do things that aren't. But I think I think breaking out of that is really key. Do we want?
Thank you.
This will be
Thank
our
you.
last question in the back here.
Well, no pressure.
Yeah, no pressure. So your answer to the last question may have answered this question. I am looking for a pat answer when, one line, when adults and children, I find, say, I'm not creative, I can't draw. Do you have a pat answer?
You've heard me so far. I don't seem to have pat anything for this.
I'm amazed. I'm an elementary school teacher, and I've taught it all, and I currently now teach art. And I really thought that kids would not criticize their own work. And by age 7.
Oh yeah, 7 is where.
By
it kicks
age
in.
7, they are saying, "Oh, yours is better than mine. I can't do this. My drawing's not." It makes me crazy.
Well, I'll say. I would say maybe the best reference for it is not a pat answer, but the cartoonist Lynda Barry, who's just up the road in Madison. Her book, I mean, she's got a couple of them that, you know, she's a cartoonist forever and extremely successful and famous cartoonist, but she turned to sort of doing workshops and sort of creativity, things around writing and drawing, She has a book called Syllabus on her syllabus, and there's also Picture This, which is about drawing, and What It Is, which is about writing. But any of those, Lynda Barry, Lynda, I think she has a funny cartoon. I don't know if she drew it or one of her students drew it. She's now teaching at Madison, drawing for non-drawers classes. I mean, very similar territory. I've been to her lab once and taught her class. But she has it's this terrible drawing of dog and beaver talking in there. I mean, it's, you know, like a 7-year-old would draw it or a 5-year-old would draw it, whatever. It's drawn by a college student, but. And then she has this commentary on it, like, Gene, you may have to help me out because you might know it. They say, I do not like that drawing. And then the other character says, the drawing survives whether, the drawing doesn't care whether you like it or not. It's still, you know, whatever, I'm not getting it quite right. I wasn't primed for this question, sorry. I don't have pat answers. But I think that's the point, is you have to get, I mean, like, do you think that my students' drawings at the end are amazing? Yes? In a technical way? No. So, I mean, her drawings, I think that's, I mean, I'm going to write a book chapter with her because I've shown this like 150 times because it's so good. But it's not so good because her hand skills are so good or because she's trained. It's so good because it forced her to think in different ways. And how we get past that criticism, I think, is really hard. And I think Lynda Barry's work is one of the more important ones for that because, you know, that it's not about bad or good. It's about, did it do something for you? And I mean, I don't know. That's such a huge societal question about how do we stop being critical. If I come up with a pat answer, I will send it to you. Thank you, and good luck.